What's up, everybody? Jeff here, and I'm super excited because today I'm sitting down with Kyle Rowan from Wyrd Miniatures. How's it going, Kyle?
Hey, hello. I never know what to say here because I'm speaking to you, but also people on the internet. So hello.
That works perfect. We're gonna have a conversation here about Vagrantsong, Wyrd's newest board game. But before we jump into that, for anybody who might not know who you are, do you want to just give us a quick intro to who you are and what your role is at Wyrd?
Sure, yeah. Hi everyone, I'm Kyle. I am the design lead over at Weird Games. Pretty much every game that we make, I touch at some capacity. Most recently, as Jeff's just said, Vagrant Song is kind of my baby. But I've been here for just about 7 years now. So started working on things with the other side, Through the Breach, Malifaux, Bayou Bash, Darkness Comes Rattling, the whole nine. So
Quite the resume there. So like I said, the sort of the newest thing on the list is Vagrant Song, which is a super popular, really well received board game that's really exciting. And there's going to be some new stuff coming up, which we'll talk about in a bit here. But everybody knows what I want to know about, and that is the lore. So let's start with can you tell us a little bit about what the story and the background is for Vagrant Song?
sure. The premise is pretty simple. It we dive into the trope of the haunted ghost train. For us, it's the six vagrants, all from different places, hop on the same train and have to collaborate in order to figure out how to escape and how to save the ghosts that are trapped aboard alongside with you. Throughout the game, you'll end up figuring out a little bit more about why they're there and who's keeping them, and hopefully you get off the train safely.
Yeah. So where did this idea come from with the kind of vagrants and the haunted train? Was that always something that was planned for the game, or is that something that came in later?
So the game development started off with a different concept altogether. We were working on a dungeon crawler at the time, and for one reason or another, the theme wasn't really resonating with me. It wasn't going deep enough. Like I need to have a deeper connection with the characters or with the lore, and it just wasn't clicking for me. So I pitched a handful of ideas. Vagrant Song was the Hail Mary of those ideas, and that was the one that resonated the most with Nathan. And here we are. Nathan's my boss. I should probably also mention that he's the owner of Weird.
He gets to approve or deny the the
Right.
ideas. Yeah. Cool. So that's interesting. So you actually had some of the development work done, at least on some level, before you decided to go with this.
Yeah, and ultimately all of that stuff got scrapped. But I mean, it did start somewhere else. And then once we kind of figured out the theme, I'm very much an experienced designer. There's kind of three flavors of designers a lot of the way. You do either mechanics first and then tack on a theme. You might do theme first and tack on the mechanics. I'm kind of a full picture movie experience kind of designer where I want to see the whole thing kind of play out organically and a balance between the two. So that's kind of where we approach Vagrant Song.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah, I think that comes through in the game, and we'll kind of get to that in a minute or two here. But so you have these six characters. They jump on this train, and then a lot of the character and story comes out through the different scenarios where you're facing these haints, which are the enemies. Um, and it seems to me like each of them has their own sort of inspiration. A lot of it's pulled from like folklore and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about that and where those ideas get pulled from?
Sure. Well, once we kind of figured out, okay, we want to do Americana and American folklore themed stuff. We wanted to pull from quote unquote real ghost stories as much as we could, and tell their stories in our own way. Um, I didn't want to just do like a full dive explanation into the characters. I more or less wanted to dip our toes into it so that if after players are done experiencing our version of Mako Joe, for example, they might be interested in researching what the real Mako lights are and figuring out what like I understand why a train comes crashing all of a sudden in the game and that sort of stuff. So yeah, we eventually just tallied up a bunch of ghost stories from American folklore, some cryptid stuff, and just kind of narrowed it down from there. The list was gigantic at first, and eventually we got it narrowed down to just 23 scenarios. I think there's 17 or 18 haints in it, with some puzzle scenarios that kind of interact with some other ghost stories where there wasn't like a specific character, like the Hoosac Tunnel story or the avalanche that hit the train in Washington, and so on and so forth. So
Very cool. And did the idea to base them on American folklore come alongside the decision of switching to the Ghost Train story, or was that something that came after?
those were kind of one and the same. Just kind of a combination of the things that I'm kind of already obsessed about. I love horror. You'll see a lot of that in pretty much every game. Maybe not Bayou Bash, but in every other game that we've worked on.
Gremlins are horrifying in
Uh,
their own way.
yeah, there's some horror there. There are giant leeches down there you don't want to deal with. um, but yeah, so I love horror stuff. I've always loved like Jack Kerouac books. On the Road and Dharma Bums are two of my favorite books. Um, and Dharma Bums is about a guy hopping on a train and dealing with that. And yeah, just kind of that lifestyle has always interested me. Of this, the hardships of the Dust Bowl and people opting in to the vagrant lifestyle of that freedom that comes alongside that, and just basically how we look at that a little bit differently today than what it actually was back in the day. Just that sort of stuff has always really interested me. Plus, one of my favorite games of all time is Final Fantasy III, and there's a ghost train on that, so maybe that had a little bit to do with it too.
I hadn't put that together yet, but that's a great point. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting because there are a lot of these stories are also things that we don't really see get covered in pop culture much. Like maybe if you go looking for it specifically, you'll find it, but it's not really something that you see a lot in mainstream, entertainment. So it's very interesting to see that stuff. So when you have a folklore story that you decided you wanted to bring over to the game, what was the process like of translating those into the game, both sort of narratively and mechanically? And did you try to stick as close as possible to the original stories, or did you take some liberties or kind of strike a balance?
I'd say we struck a balance. Some we took more liberties than others. For example, the Bell Witch is not a story about a witch with a bell. She was supposedly a poltergeist that lived in a cave near the Bell family. But so obviously we took some liberties there. There's a lot of bells reference in that sort of scenario, but she's still this 50-50 good evil character that you couldn't really put your hands on as far as like where she leans narratively, and that was part of her folklore. So we didn't try to. If we were going to make changes, we still wanted certain elements to feel familiar enough to who they were, so that we weren't just outright redefining who these characters were. But as far as how we got them to the table, it really depended on where we were at in the development phase, because Mako Joe was the first one we developed. So that one was just, how do we tell this story? And what sort of elements did we want to incorporate? And so we have this headless brakeman who tries to stop a train that comes crashing down, and here we have this lumbering guy without a head and trying to figure all that sort of stuff out. Whereas later, um, for example, the Lady in White, that was something that we had worked on much later in development, and that one we instead of because the Lady in White is kind of a generic trope. There's not really just one story where it all stems from. There's a lot of Lady in White ghost stories. So we wanted it, but all of them have the unifying theme of lost love in some variety. So that's the route we wanted to keep there. But instead, with that one, we focused more on the mechanical escalation of the fight. And really, it's the environment that tells the bigger part of the story, and she's just kind of this lost, struggling character within it. And then it gets connected later throughout the other scenarios within her chapter. So it really just kind of depended on the scenario itself, the timing of when we were developing it, and basically, if we did one thing in one scenario, we wanted to make sure that we didn't in the next, or maybe not until like 3 or 4 scenarios down, would we try to mirror that experience, just to try to really mix things up as the best we could, because I love these giant games, but I hate the repetition aspect of them. It's like, okay, this mission we're gonna go kill some mobs. All right, this mission we're gonna kill 2 more mobs than the last one, and there's a treasure in the corner instead. Um, those are fine, and I find enjoyment in them. But when developing it, I found a lot more satisfaction in making significantly more dynamic puzzles, essentially, for each scenario. So.
Yeah, I think that comes through big time in the scenarios, because each of them you have to tackle in different ways. They in some cases they feel like different games. The mechanics for how to face the challenges are completely different. And it's interesting because it's a pretty low amount of actual mechanics in the game. It's not a super complicated game like some of the other similar games out there. But even with those only a few levers to pull, you guys have still managed to make a pretty crazy amount of variety in this scenario. So I think that's really interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah. Were there any stories that you're particularly fond of, or kind of folklore references that you're particularly fond of, that you would have liked to get into the game that you didn't for one reason or another?
Oh, geez, that list is long. Yeah, there's a bunch that we didn't include um, for reasons that ultimately didn't really jive with our theme of saving ghosts. For example, like there's one that was it was in development for a long time, and then we ultimately figured out that this just isn't the right route to go. There's a story called the Bunny Man. The Bunny Man was supposedly a serial killer who killed all sorts of people, and every time he did, he would hang a rabbit fur underneath a bridge. And like that visual was very striking, and it was very much in theme of the horror aspect of the game, but saving that character felt really uncomfortable. So with the theme of bringing back humanity to these characters and humanizing these enemies, that one got scrapped. And a few other ones like that got scrapped. There's another one like the Jazz Man, which immediately, like with a name like that, it evokes certain visuals. But again, serial killer, so we avoided that. So we did try to. We ended up focusing on mostly characters that were redeemable. Um, Not all of them. I don't know if I'd describe the Man of Many Limbs as redeemable, but he was. He's kind of our Frankenstein in that, like, it wasn't his fault that he existed, sort of thing. So it kind of towed the line a little bit.
Yeah, so you can at least be sympathetic.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So this game is really interesting to me because the other, I guess if you will, Wyrd's kind of flagship game, if that's not an inappropriate word to use to describe it.
That's what we use. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. So Wyrd's flagship game, the one that people probably know you for, is Malifaux, and the narrative in Malifaux is told in a very traditional way, right? We have basically maybe a few hundred short stories that are a couple pages long, and they're told in a very narrative form, just like you would read in any kind of book.
Are we up to that many at this point? I
I mean,
don't know if I've tallied them up.
it's got to be. It's
Probably, you're
certainly over
probably right.
100. There's no way
Yeah.
it's less than 100 at this point. There's a lot.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. We're like what 300 episodes into Tales of Malifaux or something absurd.
Yeah,
So
some of them are
you're probably
two-parters,
right.
especially the newer ones
Yeah,
that are a little longer. But I mean, I guess it depends on how you count them, right? Because the older books, they tended to be divided up into, in some cases, like one-page stories that were
yeah.
kind of a continuous narrative. So I guess it depends on how you divide it. But if you just count the titles, you're way over 100, easy.
I've
Um,
never tallied it, so hearing that number kind of shocked me.
I'm gonna count it just out of curiosity. Maybe I'll add it to the video so people can see if we're way off base here. But anyway, so the narrative's told in this very kind of traditional way, where it's short stories in a traditional, in like you might read in a novel. Um, and the game is sort of an abstraction of that, right? Where in most cases, in many cases, the scenario you're playing on the tabletop is something that probably wouldn't or maybe couldn't happen in the actual narrative of the universe. You have people fighting each other that might not fight each other under normal circumstances. This game is completely different because the narrative of this game is actually tied directly into the gameplay mechanics, right? Everything is kind of told through the different dynamic things that are going on in the scenario. What do you think well, first of all, were there challenges to telling a story that way, or telling a compelling story that way? And do you think that there are any advantages to doing it that way compared to a more traditional narrative style?
Yeah, I mean a ton of challenges, and some that we're still experiencing with Encore and off the rails stuff, where it's a little bit of a tightrope in like you want to tell so much, but you also are telling a ghost story, and the best ghost stories are the ones where you know very little, where you're just given this piecemeal information. You kind of have to put it together yourself. Um, I could think of countless horror movies where I'm fully immersed until I see the monster and then I'm out. So yeah, it's certainly a balanced from a writing and a designing perspective. But there were plenty of reasons to continue that method. For one of the I don't have my board up right now, but I've got a whiteboard with all sorts of old dated stuff, and one of our pillars that we looked at right off the bat was fear of the unknown. We wanted to make sure that element was encapsulated throughout the game, and the way we accomplish that is that, well, I mean, there's multiple facets, but one aspect of it is slowly uncovering the character's story, not knowing what the event is that you're going to experience, not knowing when he's going to be changing moods or how, or sometimes not even understanding how a ritual is even meant to be performed until it becomes clear to you. So, in some ways, while it feels like a fight kind of game, it really, we approached it more from like a narrative puzzle approach. Like, when are we going to tell these pieces? How are we going to tell it? When can we make jokes versus when are we going to take ourselves extremely seriously? That was another challenge for us because you can't get scary unless you have a little bit of brevity. So yeah, no, I think that answered your question, but I got into a little bit of a ramble there.
No, that's great. I would add to that even like things like not knowing what the skills do before you buy them, right? You get this little text,
Right.
like flavor text, basically, that kind of gives you a vague hint of what it's going to do, but then you don't know until you actually purchase it. Was there a concern that all of that stuff, all of that sort of like unknown and like some of the surprises that happen, was there a concern that that could go too far and it would kind of make for a negative play experience?
I mean, yeah, there are certain elements that we could look back on and say, we could have done this differently, or we could have done that differently, based on player experience. But when we found the sweet spot of what the game was, we knew that we had to look the other way in certain aspects, and make those compromises and really push what what we were defining the game to be. So yeah, I mean, certain compromises were made, like the skill progression system, for example. The concept was that you're strangers on this train, and you are. My thought is that if you're going to get stuck in a train with a bunch of people that you don't know, you're going to try to work together the best you can to get the goal accomplished. So what we ended up doing was making sure that the skill progression felt more communal rather than individual. Like you were building out your team rather than just building out one single character. And that's where some of the hard choices came into be of like, okay, you can get this skill this time, but I want the junk card. Or that skill you got last time, maybe I could take that this turn, or that sort of thing. And having those sorts of conversations happen organically was very much intentional, to not so much the overall narrative, but to the water cooler moments, so to speak, of the game. So
Yeah, very cool. Um, there's sort of these moments in the book that are one of the ways that the narrative gets doled out over the course of both kind of an individual scenario, but then also over the course of the longer campaign. Was there any thinking about how to sort of balance both of those two things? Because a lot of the moments focus specifically on the one scenario, but then some kind of tie into the overarching kind of meta level of the game. And it seems like there's more of a focus on the individual scenarios, but I actually really liked that some of the actual narrative came out of the sort of your overall progress.
yeah, it was first we had predominantly focused on the narrative of an individual scenario, and then we also made sure that the main antagonist was still an important factor throughout, and we wanted to kind of tease him in throughout. And then each chapter also does have these stories that are connected to one another. It just depends on how deep you want to look at it. Mako Joe is trying to prevent you from getting to the bottom of the mountain, the bottom of this Husak tunnel. You experience the avalanche that happens in Snowblind, and the characters get trapped, and you experience that all organically. The Bone Orchard is about old book trying to warn you about these open graves, and that ends up becoming the man of many limbs and that sort of thing. So it just we don't always directly tell you those sorts of things. It's kind of up to the players to make those connections where they are, because again, it's a ghost story. So and it's up to players to kind of solve a puzzle that's not really a part of the core mechanic, and the story design ended up becoming a little bit of a puzzle that way.
Yeah, very cool. The the other thing that I think the way I would describe this game is it's it's got a very strong theme. I think thematic is probably the way I would describe it. For a lot of the reasons that you said, where there's a lot of things that are very unknown and things that you're kind of learning a little bit about as you go. That makes it feel a lot like a horror story. But in addition to that, even just the way that if you just look through the rule book, there's a lot of things that have flavorful names instead of what we might traditionally know them as. So like dice are bones, and you have breaks instead of like life bars or whatever you might want to call it. Was that how important was that, do you think, to the design? And was there ever any worry that that would actually raise the barrier of entry for like a more casual gamer who might have a harder time understanding it because everything has special names?
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. We knew going in kind of the demographic that we were hitting. We were going for players who were already kind of experienced in either dungeon crawls, boss battles, or higher complication of play. But ultimately, the theme we felt was so important and so interconnected to the rest of the mechanics that we felt that we needed to name them in a more appropriate way. Like, you don't die in Vagrantsong, you go westbound, and that's a very popular hobo term from back in the day. And we looked at a lot of those sort of phrases, terminology, language used, um, and we incorporated it everywhere we could. I mean, we got a bindle, so rather than just some bag.
Right.
So, um, while yeah, it does create a little bit more of a barrier if you're not familiar with those terms. Once you do become familiar with them, it feels like another layer of the theme getting added to it, and to me, that was really important.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think the sort of immersion that it provides is more valuable than the sort of ease of just flipping through the book and understanding very, very simply. Because again, it's not like the mechanics themselves are so complicated that it's still hard to play. Although I will say the game is very challenging. So if you're a casual gamer, maybe bring some friends that have some experience because I've gotten my butt kicked a few times.
Which scenario in particular?
Oh, I would have to. I'm gonna grab the book. Can't remember the name of the enemy, but it was the first time that I really got it bad. Set in Stone,
Oh,
which
yes.
is Palladian limestone.
Yeah. So she is inspired by two different ghost stories actually. Black Aggie, which is a story about this haunted gravestone essentially, or a grave sculpture, where yeah, they would hear things coming from it all the time, and then also from this the story, and of course I'm forgetting her name off the top of my head, but essentially, oh boy, I'm a little foggy on the details because it's been 3 or 4 years since we worked on her. But there was a story. I think it was a kind of a witch hunt about a woman, and they buried her under 4 different slabs of limestone. So we kind of combined both of those stories to tell hers. But yeah, no, she could pack a wallop for sure.
Yeah, it was a situation where she ended up in a bad spot, and I just couldn't lure her away from it. So she just kept putting out so much damage, and I had a really hard time keeping up with that. Eventually, I won. I ended up finishing the scenario, but it wasn't pretty. We came out of there in bad shape. So.
That's the perfect shape as far as I'm concerned. If you win, but just barely, then I've done my job.
So I'll say, like, up until then, I think that was maybe like the fourth or fifth, whatever it was. Up until then, like a lot of scenarios I had done probably better than I should have because of a couple of just like chance, lucky rolls or something went particularly well. And I was like, I can see how this could have went really poorly, but I came out in pretty good shape. Like I only had 1 or 2 wounds, and I got all the rituals done, so I got extra coins, and it was no problem. And then I played that, and I was like, oh, this is what it looks like when that doesn't happen.
Right.
But again, very thematic. I feel like it makes the game feel very it's unpredictable, but I think in a manageable way. So I think that it makes it feel like a ghost story, or a horror story for sure. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the in between. So after every scenario, you get this little like moment of respite where everything kind of calms down for a minute, and then you get this little bit of flavor text, and it's kind of vague. It's just you see something in the distance, or there's a sound or something, and then you have to choose how you respond to it without knowing what the consequences are going to be. And then once everybody's chosen, you flip this card over, and something happens, and you may get a boon for the next mission, or you might get something bad might happen to you. Um, I think I love this mechanic. I think it's really interesting because it's also frustrating in a little bit, but I think it's a really interesting mechanic because you don't know what to expect, right? And it, again, like kind of we've touched on a few times here, things are very unpredictable, and you don't know where it's going. Um, but this, I felt like more than most of the other things, was a really great way to get me immersed in the actual scenario that these characters were experiencing. So, what was the thinking behind those things? And then also, without spoiling anything for me, is there actually a way to figure out the right answer to these things, or is it supposed to feel random? Because some, it seems like there's a connection between what happens and what, like, this seems like it'll be the better outcome, this seems like it'll be worse, but sometimes it's the opposite of that. So, are you just messing with
Yeah.
me?
No, I'm pretty much just messing with you.
Okay, fair.
There's, I wouldn't say that there's like you can't look at a card and just solve it. That was never really the intent. It was instead it came from my feeling on a lack of introspection in games, where there's never a time where you could really look back and think about the things that you've done. So what we decided to do was take these moments and kind of highlight that. And it's not quite role playing, but you are making these choices in more of a personal way. And that was kind of the approach that we wanted to take there, is sensory decisions that were being made there. And sometimes those things just didn't end up going your way. As it seems like that might have been the case for you a few times. But yeah, it was largely based on introspection, and I got that idea actually from a video game called Kentucky Route Zero, where the narrative doesn't really change based on the choices that you make at all in the story, but the way you feel about the characters do. So they kind of stem from that.
I feel like, as particularly as video gamers, but as gamers in general, at least for myself, I feel like I always want to solve things. I always want to know the correct answer. I always want to have a solution that works. And at first, it was frustrating because it's like, okay, there doesn't seem to be a rhyme or reason here. But then I would let go of that at some point and said, okay, let me approach it exactly how you're describing it. And actually, I think role playing is a fairly accurate way to describe it, because those are the types of things that you might see in a role playing game. And it's not like it's gonna completely demolish the following scenario. It's not like it's having these dramatic swings in your ability to play the game, but it does, I feel, really pull you into the narrative of the game, and kind of the atmosphere, which is really cool. So I'm a big fan.
Awesome.
So last sort of high level question here. We've talked about how the game is very different from some of the other games that you've worked on. Are there any things from previous games that you've worked on that you think you brought into this? Maybe not directly like specific things one to one, but just maybe like lessons that you've learned, or things that you took away from previous experiences, narratively or mechanically, that you kind of brought to Vagrantsong? And then also, are there things that you learned from Vagrantsong that you think you'll bring back to other stuff?
I mean, yeah, subconsciously, probably I learned a great deal from Malifaux, just on how to approach playtesting, for example. I thought that was when we did the open playtest in third edition. Being shouted at by 1,000 people was a little bit of an eye opener, and trying to navigate that space in figuring out, okay, clearly there's a problem. How do we address it? And finding where you need to be, concrete, and where you need to be water. That only comes from experience. So in that regard, Malifaux has taught me a metric ton. The lessons learned as far as like things to do, things not to do, I mean, that's something that I'm just kind of learning every day. I don't think I'll ever master that, right? But Vagrantsong taught me not to be afraid to push myself. Don't be afraid to pitch that wild idea, because chances are it's the wild idea that's going to catch the most interest. Yeah, just don't be afraid to go for it, because the other ideas that I pitched alongside it were fine. There were some that were better than others for sure, but nothing quite felt so personal than this one to me. So, yeah. And as far as what Vagrantsong has taught me moving forward, let's just go back to the playtesting stuff. It's taught me to listen. There's no reason to be stubborn in your own game development. It's okay to admit that you're wrong and to pivot, and you're going to do that a lot in game development. It's important to reiterate. It's important to reinvent. And it's important not to take yourself too seriously, because I'm just a guy. I'm just making stuff because I'm obsessed with making stuff. Ultimately, once I'm done with the game, it's no longer mine. It's everyone who's playing it and gets to experience it. And understanding that that's your goal is to make fun, then learn to let go every once in a while. Which, honestly, I haven't quite let go of Vagrantsong just yet. I'm not done with it just yet, but one day I'm gonna let go of it.
I think there's something that happens with a handful of different companies I can think of, but for you guys in particular, where you make things that are loved so much by the communities that then we end up with very high standards, and we want to yell and shout when we feel like something is not meeting those standards, and often it's just because we don't know what the hell we're talking about. I've seen lots and lots of people in the community that are like, "Oh, this shouldn't be this way," and I'm like, "You're not thinking about these 10 other reasons why that needs to be the way that it is." But again, when we there's a very high bar that you've set for yourselves, so
Whoops.
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's exactly. I think it's true for the writing. I've talked to a few of the authors particularly for Malifaux before, and that's one of the things that we've talked about is that you make really good stories, so we love the stories and we want more of the stories, and when we don't get more of the stories, we're mad, and sometimes when we get the stories that aren't about the characters we want, we're mad, but it's because we're all really passionate and we really want and we really love the things that you do. So
Yeah,
I
and
would
even
encourage you to
from
take it as a compliment.
well, yeah, from our perspective, so long as someone isn't outright being like abrasive or toxic, when we see someone get heated about an opinion, we do understand that it's normally coming from a good place. It's coming from someone who cares quite a bit about the game. Um, Now, of course, we would prefer if it was a little bit more constructive than personal, but it it's easier for us to kind of wash that off, so to speak. I would say that for me, it's easier to do that with Malifaux than it is for Vagrantsong. Full transparency, Malifaux, I've never felt like it was my game. I came into it, the community was already there. I was just kind of the guy put in front of the steering wheel to just make sure that it was going in the direction that everyone wanted. And sometimes we took some detours, but Vagrant Song, when it started, was really like I was the audience, right? So that one is still a little closer to the heart, for sure.
So with that, I mean, let's talk about the big new jam. So we have two new expansions coming, Encore and Off the Rails.
Yeah.
What can we expect to see? I know there's a lot of new interesting mechanics that are coming, so we can certainly talk about those. But especially, what can we expect to see in terms of the kind of story end of it?
Sure. So the core campaign of Vagrant Song is 23 scenarios long. Really, 22. You could experience a secret one. Spoiler. Um, but it talks about a very specific antagonist. Now, Encore, which is kind of the big expansion that we're coming out with, that one can be played in an assortment of ways. You could either add the new chapter that we're adding into it as part of that campaign. So instead of 3 doors that you're choosing, you can now have a fourth. Um, and that'll further get incorporated into kind of what's going on with the Silver Ferryman. Or we have a new game mode called Short Trip Mode, and what that's going to do is provide a new antagonist, and it's going to feel a little bit like deja vu. Why is that going on again? That sort of thing. So we're going to have basically how it's going to work is that you could play any chapter as a micro campaign, and it's going to have a new beginning and a new ending. and each one of those chapters is going to have a unique in-between deck associated with it to help for further push that narrative for this new antagonist, who I won't reveal just yet. But we've also got some other lore deep dives that we're doing. Something that we couldn't get into the core game originally, but it was always a conversation as to something we wanted to do. It's called Save Your Soul Scenarios. And basically, how these are going to work is that if you're playing the Runaway and you just happen to go westbound one too many times, you're going to get stuck on the train, and you're going to need the help of your fellow vagrants to help kind of lift your spirits back up, and pull you out from being one foot in the grave. And in doing so, you're going to experience a runaway specific scenario. In that instance, you're going to experience kind of a dark moment in her past that kind of holds her down a little bit in the back of her mind, and it's up to the vagrants to kind of free her of that dark moment of looking back at things not in a regretful way, for example. So each character is going to have one of those scenarios, and in accomplishing them, you're going to get something really cool out of each one of them. So those are probably, I mean, the new chapter has got some really great scenarios in it. Don't get me wrong, but I think the Save Your Soul stuff is something I'm probably the most proud of with this expansion, because the puzzles in these are unlike anything we've done before. But yeah, we've got a bunch of other stuff set up in the game too. We've got a new type of dice called Smoky Bones. They're going to make your lives a lot easier, hopefully. There's a little bit of risk to them, but generally how they work is that you're going to be earning them through like junk effects, in-between effects, scenario effects, and whatnot. And you're going to collect Smoky Bones, and then you could take, let's say you had a really bad roll, and you really wanted to perform this skill. It was the skill you worked on for like the last 3 turns or something. You could add Smoky Bones to your roll, and hopefully turn those failures into successes. Or if you roll a music note, for example, get 2 successes out of it. It's just that you got to avoid the skull icon, for example, to make sure that those rolls don't turn into zeros. So a little bit of risk there. We've also got generic coins in there. They're going to allow you to perform more actions, to have more explosive turns, but they are temporary. So when you get them, use them. Otherwise, I guess the currency is no longer valuable. And all sorts of knickknacks, twists, doodads, and other old-timey words that I can't think of.
Awesome. The Westbound scenarios sound really interesting, because up till now, well, at least as far as I've played, all of the scenarios are focused on the Haints, and having something that's focused on kind of diving into the backstory of the characters. That sounds really cool.
Yeah, we're real excited. They do get kind of real as far as like the themes of them. So just, I guess, be prepared for that. You might find a deeper connection to some of these characters than you might anticipate. We did not go with a frills lighthearted route with these. So
Well, now I'm even more excited about it then. That sounds great. So it's 2 separate expansions in the Kickstarter.
Off the Rails makes the game harder. So
Okay.
if you didn't think the game
That's
was more
horrible news,
difficult,
but okay.
some of the cards in Off the Rails are going to add a little bit more lore. They're going to either add or more mechanics, or make you think about the scenario in a different way. So I'm really excited about those cards. They mix it up more than you would anticipate. And I'm really excited about the objective system that we have in Off the Rails as well. They're called Devious Deeds, and each player is going to have a unique deck. And essentially, you complete an objective a number of times, and then you get to fully customize your character in a new way. And that's going to be just another way to change how your songsmith works. So I'm excited what people think about those.
And that all works independently from the trinkets and skills. It's a whole totally separate thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and they don't get they're not like skills or junk. You don't flip them over when they get wounded or anything. They're just going to change a little bit how your character functions. It might adjust your passive. It might give you more humanity. It might give you a special trigger that only happens when you rummage iron nails.
Hmm.
Yeah, each one of these 10 cards in the Devious Deeds decks. Each character has 10 cards that they get to choose from and build out of. And you only get a small selection to keep permanently. But you can constantly be performing new objectives and changing out your character and that sort of stuff. So, or
Yet it's
customization
going to
is
be
always good.
harder.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
I'm
I think the
terrified.
sweet spot of experiencing the expansion is off the rails with Encore because you kind of get the best of both worlds. There's going to be good stuff with the Save Your Soul scenarios. Devious Deeds are going to allow you to customize your character more, but then you also get to experience an even more dynamic scenario that you might have already done before, and it's going to feel like it's being played in a new light. So
You can't just give us new toys and keep the difficulty the same. You gotta punish us for it, huh?
yeah, but there's going to be, it's a good and bad, right? There's a new rummage token in there that's going to help you out. It's called the Poison Berry. It allows you to remove haint effects from yourself or an adjacent friend at the cost of humanity, but we're not going to worry about that.
Okay.
And then it's going to provide a new haint action as well, or two on the card. So, and I promise those aren't going to be horrible.
I don't believe you for a second.
Yeah, that's
No,
fair.
it's gonna be horrible. And then just remind me, how does that tie into the existing campaign? Because Off the Rails, is that the mini campaign? I don't know if I have this straight in my head now.
That's the smaller expansion, but you can buy that separate from Encore if you want to, and you could add it to your campaign. You could add it to your full Encore and Core campaign. Basically, there's at this point with the expansions coming out, there's going to be so many levers that you can adjust and customize your own experience with. You could say, you know what, I don't want Save Your Soul scenarios, or I don't want to play with Encore, but I want to play with Save Your Soul scenarios and Off the Rails, or or maybe I just want to play Encore Off the Rails, and just play the short trip of the Bridge of Leaves chapter. There's going to be so many different ways that you can play the game now.
So you get just as much punishment as you can handle.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Are there plans either through stretch goals or maybe down in the future to continue adding to the game, or is that all too far out to speculate on?
So we do have Off the Rails. That's going to add replayability to Core and Encore. We do have some stretch goals in mind for the Kickstarter that will, or may, I should say, provide new scenarios. We'll just have to cross our fingers and hope that we hit those thresholds. But yeah, and we got one that we're cooking up right now that I can't talk about specifically, but I'm still kind of pinching myself that this collaboration is happening. So I can't wait to reveal that when I get the opportunity to. As far as is that once we're done with this Kickstarter, are we done with Vagrantsong? I don't know. Ask me again at the end of the Kickstarter. Right now, I don't have any plans on working on more of it, but I'd be lying if I said I was ready to let go. At the same time, there's still so many stories that we could tell, so many ghosts that we could still touch on, so many cryptids that we'd like to add. I just found my coworker Kimberly just let me know about a cryptid in Pennsylvania. I'm from Pennsylvania. I had never heard of this thing. It's called the squonk. It's like this naked mole rat crying pig thing. I don't think it's ever going to make it into Vagrantsong, but what the heck is that? So just researching some of this. There you go. There you go. Yeah, that fits right into Bayou, actually. So we'll see.
There's very few things that wouldn't fit somewhere in Malifaux. There's always going to be something. It's either
Right.
Marcus or Zoraida. There's somewhere it'll go. Awesome. Well,
So
I'm definitely looking forward to seeing where that goes. If people want to keep up with you or Vagrantsong or the Kickstarter, where's the best place to do it?
I'm on Twitter or X or whatever you want to call that. It's
Yeah.
Roanoke, Rowan OAKE, or Weird Games. Play Weird is across the board on all socials. And if you want to sign up for our Notify Me page on Kickstarter, just Google Vagrant Song Kickstarter. It's going to be the first link.
Yeah, I'll link it in the description. Make it easy.
There you go. I don't know the link itself. I've got it. I've just got it up on one of my tabs, and just not constantly refreshing it, watching the numbers go
Right,
up or
yeah.
anything. But yeah, that's where you can find me.
Awesome. Well, that sounds super exciting, and thank you so much for coming on and telling us all about it. I'm looking forward to it. Kickstarter is still scheduled for mid-September. Is that right?
Mid-September. Once we get closer to that window, we'll probably make an announcement of the official date. But just check out that Notify Me page. It's the best way of keeping track of it.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Hey, thanks for having me. This was great.